Hey everybody, I hope you're doing well and I hope you're ready to talk about some analytics. So my name is Em, I use she, her pronouns, and I work for Microsoft as a cloud advocate. I also do a lot of experimental indie game work on my own, particularly surrounding sort of combining experimental narrative with non-traditional interfaces and custom hardware. But this talk is really much more me wearing my businessy product manager-y hat than any of that cool stuff. Find me on Discord if you want to chat. So, as I mentioned, or you might have gleaned from the schedule or the first slide, this is a talk about analytics. So I'm specifically really interested in this question of looking at the way that commercial free-to-play games measure everything players do and use that to drive out their entire decision-making process and saying, is that even remotely relevant to people making independent, more experimental narrative games? And the answer in broad strokes may very well be no, but I think there are a lot of cases where there are very specific tools in this tool belt that might actually be applicable to people making smaller, more personal games. So this talk is really going to be in three different parts. I'm going to start by talking about, well, how do free-to-play games do things? Let's walk through this conceptual framework for this entire sub-industry within the games industry. Then we're going to talk a bit about, given all of that, well, what is applicable to people making smaller games and more experimental games and independent games, and what stuff is not. And then finally, we'll dive a little more practically and say, cool, you think there might actually be value in adding analytics to your game. How would you actually go about doing that? What are some practical tools you can use? I'm going to be talking a bit about a library that I wrote for a Twine game that I made. But even if you're not using Twine specifically, I think it'll still be helpful. Again, this is a pretty weird talk because I'm not sure that a lot of the stuff I'm saying is actually a good idea. I think worst case scenario, you'll come out of this knowing a bit more about a corner of the games industry that you might not have known about. Best case scenario, hopefully you will actually leave with concrete ideas about how you can use some of these tools and techniques to learn more about how your players feel about your work and your writing. So let's all put on our PM hats and look at how free-to-play games actually use data. For any sort of software, whether non-game software or games in general, use numbers to make decisions. Free-to-play games are sort of at the top of the list in terms of how strictly they adhere to the religion of the metrics data. And to be clear, a lot of the stuff that I'm about to describe, I do not generally endorse the way that it works. I think, like as I said, I think the thing I'm about to describe is pretty directly irrelevant to most of the people in this room, or virtual room, even if you are working in free-to-play games. Like this is sort of stuff that as a narrative designer or a writer or a game designer, you are maybe thinking about this less than the product managers are. But I think learning how this functions is going to be really useful before we talk about how we can co-opt techniques from it for other things. And also, this is a very mile-high view. It goes without saying that different studios operate differently. I am not talking about how every free-to-play game studio in the world uses analytics. This is sort of an abstracted overview based on my own experience working in free-to-play games many years ago, as well as talking to some folks I know who have done it more recently. So, if you are a PM on a free-to-play game, you are looking at your game as a product that converts essentially user eyeballs into money. And in order to do that, you have this sort of funnel that you narrow in on. You're going to get some new users who are going to download your game, they're going to play it. In 2020, this is largely through paying money to acquire these users through channels like video ads. Of all the people who download and install and play your game, some number of them are going to come back the next day, the next week. Not all of them, but hopefully a lot of them. Of the people who keep coming back and are excited enough about your game and the stories you're telling to keep playing it, some of them are eventually going to give you some money. And then, of all those players who are giving you money, hopefully some of them will keep giving you more and more and more money and will become what free-to-play games or the casino industry calls whales, where a lot of games have the property where the vast majority of their revenue come from a tiny, tiny fraction of players. Again, I am not endorsing the system, but this is the way things are. And so if this is what you're looking at, you can see how numbers might become important. That if you're looking at this funnel where you're losing people at each step of the funnel and you end out with some amount of money, if you can sort of staunch the bleeding, if you can slightly increase retention, if you can slightly increase the average amount of money that a paying player is giving you, that's going to make you a lot more money. So we need some metrics that we can put to these so we can measure these, because once we can measure them, then we can start running experiments to see how we can make things better. So for the most part, there are really 3 high-level guiding metrics or classes of metrics that you look at for this funnel. The first is retention. So are people coming back and playing your game? This is typically measured in what percentage of players are coming back a certain number of days after installing. So day 1 retention is for everyone who downloaded and installed your game, what percentage of them came back the next day to play it again. D7 is how many players then logged on 7 days later to play the game, etc. You don't usually see this measured beyond day 30, which I think is really interesting, and I would love to talk to someone about this. But I think that also ties into part of the weirdness around retention is it often gets used as a proxy for fun. So it is difficult, if not completely impossible, to come up with a single number from your game that represents are players actually enjoying your game. So retention ends up being used as a proxy for that, just because you assume if they're coming back day after day, they probably actually like it and are having fun. Although I would argue that's really tricky when a lot of these games are using psychologically compulsive techniques to essentially addict their players, so it's hard to separate out, are you coming back because you're addicted or you actually enjoy it? And figuring out that distinction is above my pay grade. But so you'll also typically do, with this, you'll typically do what's often called cohort analysis, where instead of just looking at overall retention, you will look at retention among a group of people who started playing on the same day, which makes it very, very easy to look at how things change over time. So if like long-term or short-term retention immediately drops after you launch some new thing, that can be a good sign that you did something wrong. Next is revenue, which is exactly what it sounds like. This is the most fun jargon-heavy one in that there are a million different ways to slice and dice this based on, are you talking about revenue per user across your entire user base or just for the people who are paying you? Are you looking across the lifetime of a player or just for the active, like a single day, etc. So you end up with these really fun acronyms like ARPPU versus ARPDAU, but money is money. And the last one is the weirdest one, sort of. So this like framework of reach, retention, and revenue is what we used to use when I worked at Zynga about a decade ago in the era of Facebook games, where this reach metric was all about how are new people coming into your game at the top of the funnel. And at the time, this was coming from, well, the way that new people come into your game is through virality, and you design things into your game that entice players to bring their friends in. So this really was something that as a game designer, you were thinking about the ways in which your game encourages new people to play it. That is not how things work in 2020. These days, like mobile free-to-play, which is where most things are, is all about paid user acquisition, primarily through video ads. You might have experienced either personally or through like online articles this whole weird world where video ads for games have gotten bizarre and creepy and body horror-y and don't actually reflect the games themselves. But so this is a whole world where this is still very heavily metricized and people spend time crunching these numbers to a flaw, but this is not a thing that game designers worry about anymore. If you are at a free-to-play studio, the designers and the PMs and the product team aren't really working on this. This is like a user acquisition team somewhere else dealing with ads, but still like an important part of that funnel we were looking at. So if we have these sort of 3 guiding metrics, the question then is, what do you actually do with them? Like they're telling you strategy, but you still need tactics. And what do you actually do day to day? What do you actually add into your game to track things? And so typically a product owner on one of these free-to-play games will add tracking into games with an eye towards answering specific questions. I think there are a couple different examples of these that I can go through. So when you are launching a new feature in a game, or if it is a like narrative-based game, things like, are you launching a new story? Are you launching a new episode in a long-running story? Are people playing it the way you expected them to? Are people playing it at all versus ignoring it? Are they getting all the way to the end? You can visualize any of these new things you're shipping as a funnel itself and see, is it effectively doing the thing it's supposed to do? You also might have a number that represents the overall health of your game in a sense. So when I worked on Words with Friends, the number that we really cared about was the total number of turns played per day by all players across the entire game. So when you have 25 million daily players across all platforms, that's a very large number. But it was still really useful to look at how it fluctuated. And if that number got way lower or way higher than usual, either over an entire day or even like saying by noon this hasn't gotten where it usually has, that's a really good sign that, you know, maybe we shipped out some bad code that's breaking the game, or some new feature that we just launched is really not doing what it's supposed to and is actively hurting things, or even there's a real world event that's affecting things that we need to look into and think about. Like if you look at stats right now, people are playing way more mobile games than they were a couple months ago, because it turns out when you're sitting at home with nothing to do, you're going to download a lot of free mobile games. This is also sort of the inverse of the first one. You're going to use that earlier high level like funnel and your sort of guiding reach, retention, revenue stuff to figure out what you should be doing next. That if you know you really need to get your retention numbers or your revenue numbers up, that is going to influence if you're deciding what sorts of stories you should be writing next based on what you know about your audience, or do you need to change the way you're thinking about monetization, those sorts of questions. So if you're thinking about sort of designing new features, you're usually going to do that with an eye towards what is the goal of this feature, what large metric are we intending to move with it, and then you will take that sort of high level goal and use that as a basis for coming up with that sort of new feature validation, like miniature funnel we talked about 2 minutes ago. So if your goal is to optimize the extent to which you can take new users, throw them into your game, and generate money, this is a pretty effective conceptual framework based in letting the numbers drive your decisions. I assume most of you watching this talk do not want to do that. I assume you are not making games where you care about if someone is still playing 30 days later, you care about are they having a meaningful emotional response to the story you're trying to tell. You actively don't want to extract money from them. This all sounds pretty gross. The good news is I think this framework as a whole complete system absolutely does not apply to you. Again, I do not endorse the system. There is a reason I am not working in this space. I could tell you some stories later over a virtual drink about ways in which I have actively rejected the system in games I have worked on and released personally. I think even if you are working on free-to-play narrative games, I suspect you are, like if you are working as a narrative designer or a writer or a game designer or a programmer, you are likely isolated from a lot of this. This is like something you may be exposed to, but you are not the one doing funnel analysis or cohort analysis. But I think all of these individual tools can still be useful. I think it's possible to use some of these same things divorced from the larger context to get a better sense of how players are interacting with your game and engaging with the stories you're trying to tell in ways that are qualitatively different from what you'd get from doing something like in-person playtesting or user feedback sessions or reading whether your community hangs out on Discord or hopefully not Steam reviews or whatever. And I think having that information can help inform design decisions in a way that results in a better experience for your players. And I think particularly there's something really interesting about being able to learn, you will have an expectation about the way your players will interact with your game and your story. That's not necessarily going to match up with reality. And I think being able to use the sort of data to reveal how large that gap is can be really interesting. I think this all depends a lot on you as an artist and a creator. You might actively not care about that gap. Your goal might be to make the things that you want to make, and if it resonates with people, awesome, but if not, that's not why you're making art. And there's a whole spectrum of approaches to creation that lie somewhere in that spectrum, and that's obviously wonderful and great. And maybe some of the stuff I'm talking about will be more or less applicable to you. But hopefully, going through some of these techniques, maybe at least some of them might spark some ideas of ways in which using numbers can help give you tools to answer questions that might help your design process. It's worth calling out that all of this stuff, we're not looking at individual players. If you're really interested in the journey of someone sitting down and playing your game and having this emotional journey, cool. Do in-person playtesting, do user interviews. All of these sort of design techniques are probably what you want. We are really interested in numbers as a way of looking at large groups of people to look at player behavior in aggregate rather than the behavior of any individual player. So to sort of ground this, I'm going to talk a bit about a project that I worked on at my day job, which was a little Twine game that's essentially a short escape room. So you're in this spooky old house and you need to solve a bunch of puzzles. Not groundbreaking by any means, but cute. And so I built out this integration between Twine and a tool called PlayFab that we'll talk about in a little bit, so that anytime a player clicked on a link or loaded a new Twine passage, which if you're familiar with Twine, you know there's a lot of overlap between those two events, but they're not always the same thing. And it took all of that information about events that are happening and what the player is doing and where they are in the game world, and they're shoving it up to a server where I had access to this sort of visual dashboard where I could write complex queries around that data set to see what players were doing. And so we broadly found gathering these analytics to be incredibly useful for answering a pretty wide set of questions and informing different design problems. So a lot of you are making games for relatively focused audiences. You generally know the people who are playing your games or who you expect will play your games. That was not the case with us. We sort of threw it out into the world. We got thousands or tens of thousands of people playing it, but we didn't really know who it was going to be sticky with. So in this case, it was great because we had the sort of basic analytics data flowing in of where in the world our players are. Are they using phones versus computers, iOS versus Android, Windows versus Mac? But also things like how many players are we getting at all? How many of them are coming back for multiple play sessions? How long are they playing on average? Like, I don't think any of these concretely led us to do anything differently, but that sort of larger passive awareness of who was playing our games was cool and useful. And like, I don't know, it might just be a vanity metric that made us feel good, but it feels like it was helpful. Many of you may have used interactive fiction tools that have some sort of automated mechanism for like validating that you don't have any impossible states in your game, or you don't have any sort of pieces of content that are technically impossible for anyone to get to, usually by sort of brute forcing their way through the game as an AI. For us, once we had some number of playtesters, analytics were able to serve a similar goal. So we could go through our sort of web interface and run some queries and figure out if there were any Twine passages that had 0 or basically 0 visits, given the number of users we had. That was pretty likely that this was not actually accessible in the game itself, which was really useful. I think this is sort of using this versus using more mechanical tools there are trade-offs either way. But in our specific situation, this was a really effective way to sort of help validate our game. It also goes without saying that neither this nor those sorts of automated testing tools are at all replacements for traditional manual QA. So our game, like, even though it was a Twine game, it felt very much like the sort of older parser IF puzzle hunt type thing, where it was less about a story and more about here is a series of puzzles, and we had a simple puzzle dependency graph, but a puzzle dependency graph of here are a couple bottlenecks where you have to solve this puzzle, and once you have solved this one, then the world opens up a bit and you have access to a bunch of different puzzles in a bunch of different physical spaces. And we ran into a situation where all of our playtesters that we watched in person play the game had no trouble with the first of these big bottlenecks. But then once we launched it and had way more users and players, many of whom were not an audience of people who traditionally played games or had maybe played the sort of puzzle game before and were familiar with like puzzle gamey conventions, we ran the numbers and many of them were not getting through that bottleneck, at least like fewer than we would have liked. So it was very easy for us to look at the data and say, great, cool, we need to more aggressively hint that puzzle, which fixed that problem. And we had the tools to know that that problem was fixed by looking at, the relative visits of the passage before that puzzle and the passage after it. This also then let us look at, in the nonlinear spaces, what are the paths that people are playing and taking? And again, not about like an individual player's journey, but we could see, for people who left the game during the section, what had they seen versus not seen? In general, what is the order in which rooms are being visited again, which led us to make a few changes about the way different puzzles were hinted in different spaces based on incorrect assumptions about which order players would visit rooms in. That is all well and good for this sort of puzzly adventure game. I assume a lot of you are much more interested in telling stories that aren't about getting the right color key to unlock the right color chest, and much more about, emotional connections to characters and making meaningful decisions, or if not meaningful decisions, meaningfully inhabiting a character and feeling like you can role play as them, or whatever the other, the myriad reasons you might play like a great story game. And that sort of technique isn't really going to work for you naturally in many situations. But I think a thing that really interests me, and this is one of the parts that I am very fuzzy on, so I'm really curious to hear if anyone ends up playing more at this and has very concrete thoughts. But say you have a binary choice. You're asking people if they want to choose A or choose B, go left or go right, kill the little sister or save her. Maybe you were assuming that 50% of players will pick one and 50% will pick the other, and you'll sort of different experiences for each of those groups. It's really interesting to see what happens when your assumption about what that split in that choice will be is completely and utterly wrong. I think no matter what, the awareness of that discrepancy between your expectation of player behavior and actual player behavior is going to make you stronger as a designer. And the more you work on, it might be literally the same game if you're not yet launched your game and this is playtesting, or if you are making an episodic game. But even if not, and you're just making more games in the future for probably a pretty similar audience because you're building up your audience as a writer and an artist, I think having that better sense of what your audience is interested in and how they're going to act is helpful. Even if, as mentioned earlier, you might actively not care about what your audience thinks, you might be making your own work for yourself. I think that passive awareness isn't going to be harmful and is usually going to be helpful. There are also some situations, not every situation, where that knowledge might be interesting and actively let you drive out new changes to your story. Like it might be a situation where if way fewer people are visiting a branch than you thought they would, like that might not be a problem at all. It might be something that you want to address, whether that is by sort of tweaking the writing that leads up to that, if that is like revealing that your players are interacting with other characters and reading the situation differently than you expected. It might result in you treating the content that comes after that differently. Like there are a whole bunch of different possibilities here that is really hard to give specific advice because it is so concretely dependent on your specific game. And I think like even that 50-50 example can be a little harmful, because I do not mean to imply in any way that, anytime you have a choice between two options in a game, like 50-50 is not always the goal. That might not be your goal. You might not even have any expectations or a goal. But again, I think in broad strokes, using this sort of automatic tracking can give you more awareness of what is actually happening to your players, which is good. A thing that we did not do, but we really wanted to if we'd had time, was implementing Telltale style, actually showing players their choices in context of what other players chose as well. And for me, as someone who clearly has some reservations about whether it is ethical to gather this data from players at all, to me it helps a lot to be able to concretely take all this stuff you're gathering and not just use it to inform your own decision making, but to actively give players a gift back that enriches their experience. But with any of the stuff, if any of the things I have just talked about seem even remotely helpful to the sort of work you are doing, it's important to remember that the numbers are not the goal. Even at the most free-to-play studios, a good PM is going to know when to ignore the numbers and go on intuition. So everything I'm talking about, these are tools where if you have a problem or a question, some of these tools might give you some more information that might be able to influence your decision. Don't let... Looking at analytics itself can become this sort of addictive Skinner boxy situation where you really just compulsively want to watch the numbers go higher. And that is actively a bad thing. So if this all sounds great, how do you actually add something like this to your game? If you've ever tried to use analytics tools, it can be overwhelming because there are so many options. I think in broad strokes, though, they fit into a couple buckets. So if you are working at a large game studio, you will have in-house tools. You might have a team of statisticians writing raw SQL queries. That's not really relevant to us. So you'll probably end up grabbing a tool built for web developers, just because that's where the audience is for these sorts of tools. And you might either end up with something like Google Analytics run by a large company, or you might end up with something newer from a smaller startup. These can be great. I think there's usually a little bit of fiddliness figuring out how to take these tools that were not meant for games and adapting them to games. But I think more importantly, I worry a lot about the ethical considerations of what is happening to your data. If you're using something like Google Analytics, Google is a large tech company that essentially runs off of selling user data and ads. You may not even be a paying customer of Google Analytics. What are they doing with all of this data that you are collecting from your users? So it's a little skeevy. Even if you're working with a smaller startup analytics tool, like they're probably not doing anything not great, but if they've taken VC funding, their ultimate end goal, like they might IPO, that's very rare. Much more likely they will either shut down or they will be acquired and be subsumed into one of these larger projects. So I personally, these days, mostly use a tool called PlayFab, which Microsoft acquired a year or two ago, which I think is great, because at least for this specific point, separate from however you might feel about Microsoft as a company, like they are not in the business of advertising or user eyeballs or anything like this. They actively don't want to know anything about your data. So that's really great and allays those concerns for me. But so what is PlayFab? PlayFab is this gigantic, overwhelming game live ops tool. They basically want to be everything you need in order to run an online game. So large MMOs are using them like Sea of Thieves for everything from matchmaking and party management to voice chat to economy management to cloud saves and leaderboards and achievements. There's a whole lot in there. But also, crucially, they have a really nice analytics module that works really well because it is a games tool. It understands how to provide analytics for games really well. And because it is this tool that is meant for these super huge games, you know, if you're watching this talk as someone who makes narrative games, you're probably going to fit well within the free tier instead of having to pay them. I have a game called Flappy Royale. It is Flappy Bird as a 99-player battle royale game. It's fun. Check it out. At our peak, we had about 180,000 daily active users, and we're using PlayFab for much more stuff like cloud saves and leaderboards, etc., and we're not paying them a penny, which is awesome. So what I built specifically was all of the stuff I showed earlier with that sort of escape room-y game. I built an integration that hooks up Twine, specifically Twine 2, with the Harlow story format to PlayFab. That's what's doing all that automated stuff I was talking about where clicking on links or traveling to passages results in analytics data flowing into PlayFab. This is a little bit of an exaggeration of how simple it is, but not much. There are basically 5 or 6 lines of JavaScript you need to copy into your Twine game. You'll need to paste in a magic PlayFab ID that you'll get when you sign up. And even though I'm doing automatic tracking of passages, I track Twine variables, but that's more manual. So if you want to track any variables, you need to type in the names of those variables so I know what to look for. And then if you do this with your Twine game, again, this is free on GitHub, you can grab it yourself. This is going to give you 2 different things. The first is it's going to send you this daily email giving you these high-level metrics about who's playing your game. Are they new? Are they coming back? What's the retention? As I said, I think a lot of these things aren't going to be actively changing the way you make your game, but I think it is really nice to get this daily email, and it can be a really nice confidence boost if you're a small team working on a game and wondering if people are even playing it. This can feel really, really good. And I've also worked on teams where a product manager spent an hour or 2 a day trying to generate a report like this, so it's super cool having it just be a thing that you get for free. The other thing that PlayFab really gives you that I didn't get a good screenshot of it is this analytics dashboard, where all of this data that I have flowing in about what passages people are visiting is there and easily queryable. So for that example I gave of a puzzle that not enough people were solving, the way that I was able to tell that is I was able to write this custom query that I was able to share it with everyone else on my team, etc., where we would look up, show me all of the number of passage visits for, the passage before the puzzle and the passage after the puzzle, and we could get really clear visualizations of how many players are reaching each of those relative passages over time. And that's super cool. And so, again, if you're using Twine, you can just grab this and drop it in and it will work. But even if you're not using Twine, other than my magic passage detection code, really all of what I'm doing is relying on PlayFab. So if you integrate PlayFab into your game separately from that, you can get all of that. The APIs for just sending data to PlayFab are really, really simple. So really what you're going to be dealing with is if you're using Unity with Ink and Yarn Spinner or whatever tool you are using to build your game, you're going to have to think through, what do I actually care about tracking? What is my base unit of content? I can recommend this general approach of just tracking every sort of unit of content, as it were, on its own if you don't have much more specific focused ideas of questions you want to answer, but really anything works. And so hopefully you will go out and, if any of this sounded even remotely interesting or useful, go out and make cool decisions that are influenced by actual user data, but not too heavily influenced, and very thoughtfully considering how and why you are capturing this data and what you're going to do with it. But hopefully it will help you become a better designer in some way, or a writer, or whatever it is you do. And that's all I got. Thanks.